Hello and welcome to the Havard Family Bible Study. I hope that you've had a great week and I hope that you are comfortable and ready to come and enjoy and follow us as we look at our next book of the Bible. I do apologise if you are experiencing any sound issues. I've had some technical difficulties this morning. I hope that I've managed to fix them, so I do apologise if my sound is not as good as it normally is. So today we are looking at the book of 1 and 2 Samuel. No, that wasn't a mistake. It was a single to give you a bit of history. 1 and 2 Samuel before the 1500s was considered one book. It was previously known as 1 and 2 Kings, and the books that we now know as 1 and 2 Kings were 3 and 4 Kings. It's called Samuel because, at least for the first part of book 1 of Samuel, Samuel is actually part of the narrative, but he dies halfway through book 1 of Samuel, and it then disappears from the story. So it's a bit of a confusion as to why they're actually called 1 and 2 Samuel. They are clearly a different type of narrative to what we see in 1 and 2 Kings, and they follow a much older form of creation than 1 and 2 Kings as we have them today. So there does need to be some sort of separation, but why the name Samuel is chosen, I don't really know. Like the book of Judges, Samuel, both 1 and 2, are made up of stories that have been stitched together. Unlike the book of Judges, there is no clear water. There's no obvious place in which these things are distinguished that we can pull out. What we do see is a collection of narratives, so stories about things that have been put together, stitched together, so that actually they all run together almost like a single story. However, a close reading of Samuel will see that there is a duplication of stories, and in some cases the duplication of the story almost changes the meaning of the original story. The main essence of Samuel is the transitional period from what was the Judges to the time of the Kings. And it follows, at least at the beginning, the story of the prophet Samuel, or the judge Samuel. He has a chosen by God birth narrative, and we kind of get that as the opening of our story. And then the story breaks, and we go off and start looking at the Ark of the Covenant. And there we have a distinct narrative looking at where the Ark of the Covenant is. It's taken by the Philistines, and here we have a really interesting example of one of the things that we've talked about earlier, which is this idea that if you defeat a people, you can almost take their gods away. And they used to do this in battle. They would defeat temples, and they would take the large statue of the deity away back to their homeland to show a decisive defeat of those people. Now, the Israelites didn't make statues of Yahweh, but instead they had the Ark of the Covenant. And we have in this narrative the idea that the Philistines come and they take the Ark away, which would normally be the end of it. That should have been the end of the narrative of the Israelites. However, we get this power of Yahweh narrative where in the land of Dagon, in the land of the Philistines are afflicted by plagues and a whole bunch of bad luck until they return the Ark of the Covenant, whereupon all of that stuff vanishes. And so it shows the idea that Yahweh has power for the first time in a land that isn't Israel. Showing this, and this is a sort of a powerful narrative, which of course is going to be relied upon during the time of exile, because it shows that this idea that Yahweh has power when they're in a different land is not a new one. The Philistines returned the ark, and once they are feeling better, they attack again. Samuel calls upon Yahweh for help, and the Philistines are just resoundingly beaten. We then get some weird internal strife over the Ark, and the Ark ends its final days in a land called Kiriath Jearim. And a long time passed, some 20 years, and all of the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. So you've kind of got this sort of idea that the Ark is no longer in place, and because of that, they are lamenting about missing God. So this here, very much this idea that the Ark represents God to the people. It's a very complicated and dense narrative, and kind of intertwined with other ideas. Samuel then appoints his sons as judges over Israel, but his sons are just corrupt. They're so corrupt that the people call out for a king. God says to the people, you do not want a king. That's not going to go well for you. You don't want one. And the people went, we hear you, we want a king. And Yahweh says, all right, on your own head be it. And Samuel appoints Saul as king. Saul is, at least in the beginning, a very good king. He conquers a lot of places, he builds up the army, he expands the borders of Israel. He then makes a mistake. He angers Yahweh because he's told by Yahweh to destroy Amalek, and he doesn't. He spares the rulers and the best portion of their flocks because he wants to make them as a sacrifice to Yahweh. Samuel rebukes Saul and then says that he's going to anoint someone in his place. Now, this is not the first time we have seen people make this mistake, where they have assumed things on behalf of Yahweh, especially when it comes to sacrifices. It's the same kind of idea that we saw in Judges around Japheth's daughter. Yahweh's told me to destroy these things. I'm not going to do it because I think Yahweh wants them as sacrifice. And there's this idea that they're trying to say, look, I know better about what God wants than God himself. And that never goes well for people. And here, Saul is told by Samuel, that's it, that's the end of your reign. I'm going to anoint somebody else in your stead. And Samuel goes off and anoints David. You may have heard a bit about David. David comes into the court of Saul. He is the armor bearer and harp player. David, remember, of course, is credited with writing many of the Psalms, but that's mostly tradition. He plays the harp and it calms Saul out of these sort of violent tempers, these really bad moods that Saul seems to have. He is the armor bearer. He carries Saul's armor, and that's how he ends up on the field in front of the Philistines' champion Goliath. He gets the armor, he brings it to Saul. He then goes out onto the field and defeats Goliath. Of course, in other narratives, David is just a random shepherd who is brought to this battle place and then defeats Goliath, and that's the point at which he's taken into the house of Saul. So already we're beginning to see a little bit of confusion as to how the narratives in Samuel are working. David becomes best friends with Saul's son Jonathan, and then we kind of get this idea that Saul takes against David. We're not quite sure why. It might be, of course, because he's destined to be king. But then there's this weird idea that Saul knows that David might be destined to be king, but still marries his daughter to him anyway. Some people have postulated that it is because of the relationship between David and Jonathan that Saul takes offense, because the relationship between David and Jonathan is an incredibly strong one, to the point where David can ask Jonathan to go and find out information from his father about David, to bring Saul down to a field to get him to talk openly about what would be a state secret so that David can hear, and Jonathan does so. There is a lot of language around David and Jonathan that suggests an incredibly deep and abiding relationship. Heart of my heart, soul of my soul. Some people have even gone so far as to suggest that this relationship was actually a romance, that David and Jonathan are in fact in love with one another. And there are places in Samuel where they are recorded as speaking that ways which would really kind of support that kind of idea. They say things like, nothing but Yahweh will come between us. We are for together entwined. Perhaps the most telling line comes in what is known as David's lament. At the start of of what is now 2 Samuel, we hear of the death of Saul and Jonathan. Now this comes in a battle. David, up to this point, he's run away, he's set up his own army, he's worked a little with the Philistines, sort of joined the opposing army, but always had a heart for his people. And when the opportunity presents itself, he rebels against the Philistines with his men and tries to win his country back. And in that battle, Jonathan and Saul die. Even though David has said, don't kill Jonathan, Jonathan dies. And in the lament, David says these words. Now this is part of quite a big lament where he says that Saul and Jonathan are beautiful. And so this is in 2 Samuel 1 verses 25. He says, Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Which is quite a powerful statement, passing the love of women. Now, some people have also said that that's just the bond of 2 soldiers. When you've got 2 soldiers that have fought well together, they have this really strong macho camaraderie bond that kind of transcends everything, because it has to, in order to be able to be willing to kind of sacrifice your life for somebody else. However, the words that David uses, Jonathan lies slain upon your high places, that is a great sacrifice. High places here means altars to Yahweh, or perhaps altars to Baal or El, which for the purposes of this narrative are the same. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. Jonathan lies as a sacrifice to Yahweh. I am distressed for you, my brother, which would support the idea that they are brothers in arms. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Now, this is not an unheard of phrase in the ancient world, but it is more kind of a Greek and Roman idea where the only true love was going to be between 2 men. And that did involve what we would think of in modern terms as homosexual sex, male on male sex. So it's a very difficult verse, quite difficult to unpack. And I think that when you look at it in context and the things which David and Jonathan are willing to do for one another, it suggests, I think, a bond that is much stronger than just 2 warriors. And I think that perhaps what we are looking at here is kind of the beginning of kind of a homoerotic, homosexual relationship, but it wouldn't have been seen as modern homosexual relationships, because remember, David also has 2 wives. Remember that would have been a function of being alive, that men married women. We know from other cultures that men who were probably gay married women just kind of as a function of that's what you did, that's how you built a household, you needed children to help run your farm and that kind of stuff, and you would still have your real lover, who themselves would also have wives and children, but it'd be with them that they spent most of the time. And it really does seem to be a factor of the way in which these ancient civilizations functioned, and that homosexuality as we see it, which is kind of this bond pair relationship between 2 people, wouldn't necessarily have existed in the ancient world because relationships were not monogamous. Romance really took a back seat towards offspring. So it's a really confused picture that we've got of the ancient world. And we know even less when it comes to the book of Samuel, and I will come to that in a moment. In Samuel 1, we have a whole bunch of really interesting stories. For example, Saul goes off and consults a medium. He goes to ask about bringing, so he can consult the dead to ask for help. What is interesting is that he is not condemned for this action. He's condemned by the dead person who says, "Why have you bothered to summon me back? What have I got to do with the living? Leave me to my rest." But he's not condemned for that action. And it's not even a complicated thing for him to do. He doesn't have to sneak around to do it. He goes in disguise, but he doesn't. It's not frowned upon, despite the fact that the laws of Deuteronomy says that mediumship and astrology and all that kind of stuff is considered an anathema. There is what seems to be a two-level approach. However, this can be easily answered by the general approach of a lot of Israelite laws, which were essentially, at their heart, what we would consider to be racist, but it wasn't. That's not how the function was in the ancient world. It was more about, look, you can do these things providing you come to our gods and do them with our rituals. But if you go to other gods or people who use magic didn't require gods, then you shouldn't do that. That's an anathema. That's going against what Yahweh wants, because you're saying to Yahweh that I can get the information I want without Yahweh. So it was a much more kind of dynamic relationship. The ban against magic wasn't a ban against magic being cast by Yahweh and for Yahweh and through the prophets of Yahweh, and we can see that being used in later parts of these books, but rather reaching out to other deities. So there is in this idea of monolatry. Now, we've touched on this before. Monolatry is where you believe in one god and accept the existence of others. A lot of these rules wouldn't have been a problem if they believed that the other gods straight up didn't exist. Because if they straight up didn't exist, what's the problem? You can go and speak to a medium, but it's not going to happen. The god doesn't exist. So you end up in this situation where the laws, the prohibitive laws, are in and of themselves giving us a window into how people thought and lived and believed. We're going to come to that when I'm finally brave enough to attack the book of Deuteronomy, which is a big book and is going to take a lot of doing. Now, one of the things that I just want to touch on before we move off is I want to touch on the state of the book. Now, the book of Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel, is in an awful state in Hebrew. It's very difficult. It's got a lot of scholarly mistakes, and there are some parts in the text where it is just impossible to know what it says. Now, I'm going to put a caveat on that because this video obviously is done in a point in time, and it is based on my current best understanding. However, since the discovery of the Qumran scrolls, work has been ongoing to undo these scrolls, to clean them up, and to translate them. That work has been incredibly slow, and for a whole bunch of political reasons, not all of that text has been available, work on it has been stalled, and there's a whole bunch of problems with the work itself. Nevertheless, translation still goes on. In the Qumran scrolls, they have found extant pieces of the book of Samuel, and we are finding I'm part of this, my Hebrew is nowhere near good enough, but scholars are finding that these texts are clearer and seem to support older readings. Now, to explain this a bit more, I'm going to need to give you just a really quick, brief overview of how we go about finding these older texts. We have, in Greek, two surviving manuscripts. We have the manuscript Vaticanus, which was found literally in the Vatican, in the library. Somebody stumbled across it and went, oh, look, this is an old Greek copy of the Bible. And the Septuagint, the LXX. It's called the Septuagint because it was believed to be translated by 70 scholars from Hebrew into Greek. These manuscripts, we know their provenance, we know how old they are, and when it comes to the book of Samuel, we see that they are clearer in some ways than the Hebrew, or as in the Hebrew text that we have to us today. The Greek often paraphrases, because one of the problems when you're translating from one language to another is you are forced to paraphrase in your new language in order for it to make sense. So you can't say things in a direct translation in order for people to understand what's going on. It has long been known that these two manuscripts, when it comes to Samuel, are able to fill in some of the blanks. People became cautious of doing that as our knowledge of textual criticism grew, as we began to find more manuscripts. And we're not just talking in Greek here, but we're talking some pieces of text in Aramaic. We've got some pieces of text coming out of Ethiopia, in Coptic. So there's a whole raft of translation and work going on in this area. The Qumran scrolls showed us that the Greek text was in a lot of cases more accurate than our received Hebraic text. But even then we still end up with gaps. Now, let me see if I can give you an example. In 1 Samuel 13, we have a piece of text that has long been the subject of debate. Because there are numbers in it, but we don't know what they are. Some people have had a guess at it, tried to make sense of it. Other texts have, the texts don't really agree, and we don't know where we are. Now, when I looked up this particular piece of text for this video, there didn't still seem to be a consensus. I don't necessarily have access to a whole bunch of academic journals, so that may not be the case. But if it is, we are talking scholarship in the last sort of 4 years, 5 years. But this is, like I said, a living piece of text. So the text, as we have it, reads, Saul was something years old when he began to reign, and he reigned something and 2 years over Israel. We don't know. We do not know what those numbers are. We can't make sense of them. And that's because of the state of the Hebraic text that we have. We've been able to reconstruct some of it because ancient church fathers, Origen, Eusebius, Josephus, who of course is an Israelite historian, just wholesale recorded the text for us. They quoted it as part of their histories, as part of theology, and that text is often better than the received Hebraic text that we have. We've also found, obviously, in the Qumran scrolls, bits of text that can correct us and show us how much better these texts were. And those texts kind of get us to about 100 years BCE, maybe 50 years CE, so kind of around the time of Christ. So these are quite old texts, and 2,000 years old from where we are today. But it doesn't help us date the text of Samuel. And if we can't date the text of Samuel, then we run into a problem when you try to understand things like Jonathan and visiting a medium. Because what we need in order to understand how these things would have been received is to be able to place it in a time scale, to be able to go, well, look, this is roughly where we think it is. Most scholars seem to think that the Book of Samuel arrived in its final form, that is the form that we have it today, as a lot of this Pentateuch did in the time of Josiah, or perhaps in the time of his father, when a lot of work on these books and putting them together was made. The Hebrew changes in style and in nomenclature and in their use of words, so we can see that we are looking at a text that has been put together, not in a single narrative. But it has been done cleverly, unlike Judges where you can clearly see the lines. It's been done cleverly so that actually seeing the gap in the narrative is quite difficult in English, and some of that lies at the foot of our translators, who of course have translated it as the book that we have and have smoothed over some of these edges. It does also make picking out the pericope, the little bits of text like we could do in Judges, quite difficult, but it is possible. And there are some things in there that allow us to kind of time-bound things. References to silver coins, which we know at least were in existence in the time of Persia. So at least the text needs to have been aware of those silver coins in the time of Persia. Now, whether or not those coins were older than that, we still don't know. Archaeology hasn't really been able to give us an answer, but that at least gives us a time bound for it. The moment, scholars seem to be thinking that the pericope, these narratives, are old. So we are talking around the time of 1000, maybe 900, 800 BCE when they were written down. Either memories of the fact or shortly after the fact. We can see in the narrative of the Ark, which I read out earlier, which says, and Israel mourned for 20 years. 20 years is a short time of passing as opposed to 40 years, which is a long time of passing. That people writing this text were thinking about an event that people knew about, maybe grandfathers, great-grandfathers, a story that was still in living memory. We would be talking, so it was something that was written down very close to the fact. I think that we're in the same place as we are with the Book of Judges with Samuel when it comes to dating. We are looking at texts that are brought from all over the place and kind of stitched together. I think Samuel is likely to have been a sort of an almost mythic figure, whereby he was kind of the prophet to which so much was attributed. And David, I believe, probably existed, which puts me in the minority. A lot of people aren't sure whether or not David existed at all. I think he probably did. I'm not sure that he did build the great kingdom that he did build. And we'll talk a bit about that when we come to the Book of Kings. But it wasn't unusual for kings, when they are recorded their victories, to just outright lie. We can see this on the walls in Egypt, where kings have gone, I defeated these people, and I did this, and I did that. And then we'll find other texts that go, yeah, but I defeated that same king that just said that they defeated me. Just outright lies. Because it was all about kind of grandiose and telling your story after you lived. You had to have been quite a great king and have to have like a lot of love of the people to be able to just blatantly lie like this. Or what I suppose the kings would have said was it's good PR. And we also know that a lot of people, children of kings, would big up their parents so that they could go, I stand in the line of this great king. And even to the point where they would say, this victory I have done in the name of my father, especially if he was a more loved king than you are, because it worked well for PR. It can also be difficult in the ancient times, because how do you know when the king has changed if you are a peasant living in the middle of nowhere? You get to know eventually when the news filters out to you, which can be 2 or 3 years later. And at the rate of some of the kings, the king could have changed by the time you've heard of it. So a lot of it was about kind of keeping this image going. David has a lot of stuff attributed to him that really makes him look impressive. He defeats Goliath. He is a great king. And that phrase is repeated despite the fact that as we get to the end of the book of Samuel, David starts making mistakes. And we're going to talk a lot, I think, about who David is and how that works, because I think David, because he was so writ large in kind of the memory of who people of Israel, and of course in the theological memory of Christians, where remember Jesus stands as a David, a new David to the fight, a new kind of king over everything, that we really need to look at David and understand what's going on there. So we will be using a lot of the book of Samuel and a lot of the book of Kings. The book of Samuel basically transitions us to King David, it gives us Solomon, and then we enter into the book of Kings. And again, we'll talk about the book of Kings in another video. So the book of Samuel, to sum up, is a complicated book. It often has two competing narratives. One that says we need a king, and another that says you don't want a king, you want to stick with chieftains or judges. It is the kingly narrative that wins out, and there is a suggestion from the text that the Israelites don't want to be different. They're looking at all the kingdoms around them, and all of them have kings, and in order to do business, in order to be a kingdom and to actually survive in that world, they would need a king. And despite what their God says, that's the way they go. But the text shows that that transition wasn't easy. And even when the king had become a de facto standard, remember that these books probably came to their final form in the time of Josiah, when we've had kings over Israel for some 400, 500 years in various forms. There is still this anti-king narrative that survives in these books, which is a really interesting record of how people were thinking and how people have used these stories, even at the time in which they were written. If you ever thought that the Bible was straightforward and you could just kind of dip in and get an answer, I'm hoping that by now, especially by the time we've reached the book of Samuel, you're beginning to see that it's not that straightforward. And that's what makes these books so exciting, is that you could read them, reread them, you can reach for commentaries. And let me just show you, this is a biblical commentary that I reference. It's the Oxford Bible Commentary, if you're interested. Covers absolutely everything. That's the whole thing. It's like that. Get the new edition. Always buy the new edition, because that's how your information gets out of date, is that once they've stuck it in books, it's already out of date. These commentaries even themselves record how difficult these books are. It's a fascinating subject, and I hope that you'll enjoy coming on this journey with me. Let me just so where am I? So thank you very much for joining me. It's been great. We're working through Samuel. Now my plan is to pause here and take a bit of a break. We've come to the beginning of Kings, and we're beginning to move into what is the new era, the modern era of Israelite theology. So we're going to pause here, and I'm going to take a break because there's a lot of other stuff going on, and some of this stuff is going to take some preparation, and I have run out of the prepared Bible studies that I have done. So please do stay tuned. We should be back probably in September, which for a lot of people might sound like a while away, but September is only next week. So we should be back sometime in the middle of September, probably towards the end of September, based on how much stuff we've got going on. So to find out when we're starting back, please do check our Twitter feed and our Facebook, because it'll be all over that. And please also check our website and our YouTube if you've missed any of the videos that we've done so far. Our churches run only through kind donations. If you are able to donate, please do consider donating through PayPal or through Gift Direct. There will be also on our Facebook, we are just launching some new fundraising pushes to help our churches, because COVID, obviously, like all charities, has really affected our ability to fundraise. You know, there have been no fairs, there have been no bake sales, no film nights, no soup lunches, all of this stuff that we do to fundraise to help our charity work. All of that has kind of gone. So we are just asking people if they are willing to just be generous and to help us so that we can be here to support our communities for another 100 years. But of course, look after yourselves first. Make sure that you've got food, shelter, clothing, and warmth before you consider donating to a charity, because essentially, otherwise you'll end up needing our help, and we would rather have, while we're always here to help, we would rather that it was your donation to us that put you in need of our help. Whatever you're doing this week, remember that if you want to tune in on Thursday at 10:30, we've got our Welsh Eucharistic service. We are back on Twitch on Sunday at 10 for our morning prayer. And remember, that service is now recorded, because at 11 o'clock we are back in St Thomas's Church for a said communion. We are still looking at opening St David's Church, but that's there's a few. We're working on it. It's in our hands. We'll get there. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that whatever you're doing for the rest of the day, you have a great time. Look after yourselves. Remember, wash your hands. Wear a mask. Stay 6 foot away from people where possible. Stay home and stay safe. And whatever you're doing, go well and go with God. Amen.